Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 4 of this Gyan course. So, the first 6 lectures, what we had covered was most of the technical aspects of model development, or how do we apply these models for different clinical use cases. We looked at the first day we looked at radiology informatics. The second and the third day was focused on digital pathology or pathology informatics. So today and tomorrow, for my parts of the lecture, we'll segue a little bit and cover some of the non-technical aspects. And by that, what I mean is, it's not that just because it's non-technical, it's not important. In fact, in some sense, it's more important than the technical aspects. That's because what we'll be covering in these 2 lectures today is you have developed your models, you have developed your AI systems. What are the different factors that we need to consider before and during deployment of these AI systems in the clinic? And this holds good not just for AI systems that have been developed for medical imaging applications, but these rules and these concepts that we'll cover today will also hold good for AI systems that are in the non-medical domain. So let's say that you're working on some sensor-based technology that will be at some point used in the clinic, right? Or some large language models that you'd like to deploy in the clinic. So there are some of these commonalities between different domains that lie in the themes that we'll be covering today in today's lecture. So it's titled Clinical Considerations for AI Deployment. So what we'll be doing is, so when I say the different considerations, we'll be looking at some of the practical aspects, right? So for example, what this image covers here today, what this image here, what the different factors that I have in this image. So clinical workflow fit, what do you need to do for validation and generalization, right? So interpretability and trust, some parts of it we covered yesterday. Regulation and governance. So we'll touch on some of the regulation and governance part tomorrow, but these are different factors. Human AI interactions, we touched on that, and then how it's all reliability over accuracy. Before that, so I have this, so if you look at the last line here, I say that performance enables deployment, reliability enables adoption, right? So what does that mean? So if you think about AI systems, it's a similar thing. If you build a system where your performance is great, it'll get you noticed. But if your performance is reliable over time, if your model can adapt to new settings, that is what will drive adoption. So objectives. First, AI models in radiology will cover, we have already covered some of it, AI models in radiology and the clinical applications. Next, we'll be looking at how to understand the challenges of large-scale enterprise-level deployment of AI solutions for radiology. Thanks. And then finally, we'll look at post-implementation evaluation of these methods in clinic. So by that, what I mean is once these tools and techniques have been deployed in clinical practice, what are the different evaluations that need to be done? It's not that if you have a system, you deploy in clinic, you deploy it and you forget about it, right? So especially in AI, because these models are getting better and better, you will have new data, you will have different kinds of, let's say, corner cases that doctors will encounter, false positive, false negatives, which they might not have seen previously. All of these can be used to improve the model, right? So these are the things that you have to account for when or after the model has been deployed in clinic. So when you look at this AI model development life cycle, so what are the different things that come to your mind? So when it comes to taking an AI model, developing it, validating it, and deploying it in the clinic, what are the different parts of it? So it's not just a simple process where you fire up your Google Colab, or let's say you have your interface, whatever interface you're working on, you develop your tool and you immediately deploy it in clinic, right? So what are the different development milestones? And there are multiple. So maybe we can start a discussion here. So Anyone? So what do you think is the first step of this development life cycle?
Data preparation,
Okay, so what do you mean by that? What do you mean by data preparation?
data normalization, pre-processing, and all the like card sort
So
of data.
normalization, pre-processing. What about a step before that?
Data collection.
Data collection, right? So you need to identify a problem and you need to collect the data for that. Right. So first is identification of the problem. So you need to identify what the use case is. So let's say that you're working with radiologists. They say that one of the use cases that they want to, or one of the clinical unmet needs is segmentation of some kind of a lesion. Right. Maybe it's a very small lesion or a rare disease. So they want to detect it. They want to identify it. So you identify the problem first. Right. Now, after you have identified the problem, that's when you start collecting the data. Right. So a data collection and preparation, like you said. So you have to collect the relevant data. So you need to know what sort of cohorts are, let's say, representative or can be used to rightfully answer that question. Right. So you need to know that. So also what happens is, and we'll cover a little bit about that in the later slides. So it's not just collecting data from that one site. So ideally you would want to collect data, or by one site I mean it's not just a homogeneous thing, right? So you would like to collect data from different populations of the same disease, right? So let's say I briefly touched upon this a couple lectures ago. You have let's say African American populations, Caucasian populations, and then you have people in India, all of them having the same disease. It has been shown in multiple different studies that models trained on one population, on one race, doesn't really or doesn't generalize well to data collected from another population, right? So if possible, we need to collect data with as much heterogeneity as possible. So next step, model development. So choosing the right algorithms and designing the model structure. Okay, so you have to choose. So there are multiple different algorithms that you can choose from. So which is the best algorithm to go with? Like, do you go with something that's more recent, more fancy, or do you go with something that is more tried and tested? Right. So a lot of times, what happens, and you'll realize this over the course of, if you are into research, you'll see that the fanciest methods, the more sophisticated methods, they are not the ones that give you the best answers. Sometimes very simple solutions can be the elegant ones and can actually help you solve the problem that you want to solve. So once we have identified the problem and collected the data, prepared the data, in fact, in data preparation, there are a few steps that you mentioned, pre-processing, right? So before pre-processing, in fact, it goes hand in hand. You need to do a quality check, right? So there, at times, there will be a lot of outliers. If you remember in the whole slide images, I said we covered how there might be outliers like cracks on the slides, or there might be some air bubbles, or there might be out of focus regions. So in radiology images, you can have different kinds of artifacts. So one of the artifacts is in the MRI machines, if there is patient motion. If there is patient motion, what would happen if there's patient motion? Anyone? So you saw these brain images, brain MR images, right? So what would happen if the patient moves slightly?
I think the images would have multiple instances of the same organs.
Yes. So what happens is you'll see some sort of artifacts where you'll see sometimes it's called aliasing. So you'll see, let's say, the skull appearing multiple times, right? So there'll be a lot of noise. So we need to have pre-processing steps that can account for and that can correct for this noise. And like you rightly mentioned, we need to do some sort of harmonization. So if you remember in the earlier step or in the data collection step, ideally we would want to collect data from data with as much variability as possible. So what that means is you could have data from scanner 1, which is a GE scanner, scanner 2, which is a Philips scanner, scanner 3, which is a Siemens scanner. So you can have multiple scanners. And at times you'll see that when the same patient is scanned with different scanners, or let's say the tissue of the same of a given a patient of a given tumor for one patient is digitized with multiple different whole slide image scanners, you'll see the quality of the images are slightly different. Okay, so what does that mean? So that it's the same patient. The disease is still the same. When the doctors look at it, the doctors will still diagnose, hopefully diagnose the exact same disease. But what we want to make sure is that the computer, when we give these images to the computer, we have to make sure that they're sort of normalized, harmonized to the same space, and have as little variability as possible when it comes to providing images from multiple different sites. Okay, so what could be the next step after model development? Training is a model development, right?
Then testing of the model.
Right. So you need to do a model training, and then you need to have a testing. So by testing, so there are multiple steps. So sometimes you'll see that validation and testing are used interchangeably, but and this is very important, in the context of machine learning, training, validation, and testing are 3 distinct steps, right? And we'll cover about that in the next few slides. So model training is once you decide what model you want to use, and let's say you have some sort of, there are multiple parameters that you have in your model. You have different strategies for training, for identifying what the parameters are. So model training will actually have, there will be multiple parameters that you can have in model training, right? So there are algorithms like grid search algorithms or other kinds of algorithms that can be used to identify the right set of parameters. Now, once you have done that, you want to validate it. So how do you decide what the best set of parameters are? Like there'll be, so let's say that you have an equation, right? Ax plus by equal to c, right? So you can have multiple values of a and b, for example. So how do you decide what the right values are, or what the best values are that give you the best estimate of c? So that is something that you decide in your validation step. You do not touch your test data set. Your test data set remains completely untouched, right? So you finalize your model parameters on your validation set, and once you're happy with your validation performance, that's when you go to your test set. Okay? So a lot of times you'll see that, and this happens, more times than I can count. If you look at the way people, a lot of papers are written, when they provide the results, you'll see they run the different models which have been run on the validation set. They basically take those models with the different parameters and run it on the test set. Right? That's not what should be done. If you have a test set, that should be completely held out, and once you're happy, provide your validation set results with your standard deviation, obviously, because when you run different models, you will have slightly different performances. So for those of you who are working in wet labs, so let's say that you have developed some sensors. When you test that sensor to collect a reading, it's almost likely that every time you collect the reading, there'll be some error, right? So sometimes, so let's say you're collecting the blood pressure, you'll have a particular value x, and the next time you'll have x, you'll have y, next time you'll have z, and these might be slightly different from each other, right? So what that means is that when you report it, you will have to report the average value. You also have to report the standard deviation. Now, when you report the standard deviation, if the standard deviation is really high, what that means is most likely your sensor, your model, it's not that good, right? It's collecting, it's giving you readings which are way off from each other, assuming that nothing is changing with the patient, right? So ideally, the confidence interval, the standard deviation should be low within permissible limits, and that's something that you have to decide depending on what your application is. And that standard deviation basically decides, how robust the model is. But once you have done that, you take, whatever the best parameters you have from the validation set, test it on the test set, and show the results. So you can test the model's performance and refine it for better accuracy or better AUC, better F1 score, whatever your metric is. And after that this is where things actually start getting real. They start getting out of the papers that you have published, right? So model deployment. So when you start deploying the model in a real clinical environment for a real world use case, that's when you actually observe that nothing works, right? So you go from your test environment, from your lab to the clinic. That's when you see that, okay, what I did, I probably need to redo, or things have to be done differently. The reality of what's there in the real world is very different from what's there in the lab. And so once you have done your due diligence, once you have, let's say, arrived at a model that actually works well or works as expected, you need to monitor and maintain, right? So a lot of times you have things like model drift. So you need to monitor, continuously monitor the performance of the model. So let's say that I am a vendor, you're a doctor in the clinic, you have purchased software from me, and you are working with that software. It's not like you purchase that software, you keep running or providing images to your software, getting decisions and using it. I need to know what's happening with it, right? So I need to know if it is still working as expected. I need to know if the errors that the different kinds of artifacts or the errors that the model is actually giving you, if that is within your permissible limits, or something is happening with the model that is not expected. So you need to tell me that, I need to know that, right? So it's a two-way street. So only then can you, or only then can I as a vendor, as a model developer, can make sure that my model is up to date with the latest requirements, and also the onus equally lies on the clinician to make sure that that happens.
After model deployment and during the monitoring phase, can we also collect some sort of input and maybe for segmentation example, some segmentation information, so to identify such drifts if any
Yes.
of that happens?
So that's an excellent question, and that is something that should be done. A lot of companies do that, but many companies do not do that. So his question is, when the model has been deployed, while it is actually being used in the clinic, should we or can we collect data regarding, if it's a segmentation model, can we collect some let's say examples where the model fails, or if the model has failed, can we ask the doctor to, let's say, correct those segmentations and give it back to the vendors, to the model developers, so that they can improve it, right? So that's a question. It's if you think about it, that's how it should be done, because otherwise, how will the model developer know that the model is causing an error like that, right? So that's exactly what I meant when I said that yes, the doctor has to communicate with the vendor and vice versa, so that we know what's happening. If there is some way that we could help you, if you can provide us, let's say, some of these outlier cases or some of the cases where the model does not work as expected, maybe correct the segmentations for us, give them back, then we can fine tune our model on these kinds of examples so that it gets better. So I mean, it's easier said than done, because this is medical data. So there's a lot of ethical challenges involved here. We'll cover ethics in medical AI tomorrow. So eventually, you will be giving. So just a teaser. So this is patient data we are talking about, right? So you have to give the vendor. So the software exists on your side. So it can either be a cloud-based platform which has all these ethical requirements. Let's say satisfied. So in the US, we follow the HIPAA regulations. So, if the model training most likely goes on at the vendor's end, right? So I have my own GPU. I will train a model, and when I deploy it, I'll deploy it in the cloud, a secure cloud environment, or I'll deploy it on-prem on your machine. So, but if you want to give me data, if you want to give me patient data, that means you'll have the patient's name, you'll have the clinician's name, you'll have other kinds of sensitive information. So that actually intrudes on the privacy, right? So it's a very big thing. So back in the day, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that was probably not that big of a concern, but it's getting quite serious nowadays. So there are mechanisms of doing that. There can be some sort of a material transfer agreement or data use agreement that I, as a vendor, can sign with you as a doctor, and then which ensures that I get the data, but I don't share the data with anyone. Or you give me the data, but you remove all the personal information, all the identifying information before giving me the data. Right? So we'll cover that tomorrow. But yeah, like I said, it's easier said than done, but that's how we should be doing it. So also, so I'm sure all of you here would have used ChatGPT, right? How many of you have actually gone on to the settings page of ChatGPT and seen that ChatGPT is actually training on your data? Is everyone aware of that?
Yes.
Yes,
When
I'm
you
looking
buy
at someone.
subscription for like any of this like Perplexity or any of the AI model, they in their terms and conditions it is written that we use your data house.
Yeah, so they do that, and also there is, if you go into the settings of, I know this is being recorded. So if you go into the settings of a lot of these LLMs, you'll see that you can turn off that setting, that don't use my data for training, and progressively you'll see it's getting difficult to find out where that check option is, right? So which means they're clever people, so they train on the data that they get. So we have to be careful. I mean, it's not that we don't have the provisions of telling the models not to train on our data. We have these provisions, but you have to be careful on what sort of data you want the model to know to be fine-tuned and so on. Okay, so coming to the first part, there is a need finding and a planning stage. You need to identify a true clinical need, like I said. So you need to know, you need to discuss with the clinicians, they need to show you images. It's not like they tell you, okay, I need a model for XYZ segmentation. That is not enough. You need to sit with them, you need to talk to them about, there will be obviously more traditional problems where you can query literature, you can find out what that problem is, and maybe you can start identifying and training models on your end. But with a lot of these new problems that crop up, new clinical unmet needs, you need to sit with the clinician and understand what that problem is. They need to show you images, they need to show you some sort of data and convince you that this is a problem that is worth solving. And it's not just that. You need to look at the data and you need to decide whether that is something that can be solved, right? So let's say that so just a hypothetical scenario, there's something in the image that needs to be found, but human beings cannot see it at all, right? If human beings cannot see it at all, or experts cannot see it at all, your machines can't also see it, right? How will a machine find out something that an expert cannot? Because eventually you want to get segmentations, you want to get some sort of annotations. So if human beings cannot see it, if experts cannot see it, you cannot get enough annotations. Or you cannot get, let's say, good quality annotations if it's a very, very, very difficult problem. And if you cannot get good quality annotations, then it's almost asking too much of a model to find that out, right? So you have to make sure that it's a model. So the clinicians have to convince you that this is a problem that's worth solving, and then you have to convince yourself that, okay, there can be enough data collected, or this is a problem that machine learning can tackle. Okay? And then determine a decision action pair. So this is again where both clinicians and AI developers should work hand in hand. So what does that mean? So if you suggest something as an AI developer, or if your model suggests something, what clinical decision does it lead to? Right? So that has to be very clear. So does that lead to, let's say, changing of the treatment, or is it just an additional read for the radiologist, for the pathologist? So how would it change the clinical decision workflow? So that is something that you need to understand. Third important thing, you need to consider factors at the site of deployment, right? So I mean, yes, nowadays a lot of these deployments are on the cloud, and which means that doesn't really matter if you are at Rourkela, or if you are at Bhubaneswar. Eventually, if you use the same cloud setting, then you will have access to the same resources. But you should understand that cloud deployment is costly, right? So for those of you who have used GPUs on the cloud versus GPU in your lab, local on-prem devices, you will know that cloud deployment is costly, right? So which means that a lot of the different hospitals, a lot of the different what ends up happening is they prefer to have on-prem solutions. And it's not just because of the cost associated with the cloud, but also other kinds of, let's say, safety regulations, or there might be other factors that they're a little wary of, so they don't want to put their data on the server. They want to keep everything at their end. So because of all these things, and all of these are valid concerns. So because of this, they might want an on-prem installation, or they might want a hybrid installation where they have part of the installation on-prem and part of the deployment that's done on the cloud. So you can have different kinds of deployment scenarios, and if you want to have some sort of an on-prem deployment, that means it's important to know what sort of resources you have on-prem, right? Do you actually have computers that have enough computing power? Do you have enough GPUs? Do you have enough CPUs? Right? Do you have the technical personnel, or the personnel who you have? Do you have the technical, let's say, expertise to help you with this? Right? So a lot of these factors, many of these factors need to be considered at the site of deployment. Any questions so far?
Sir, my doubt is regarding the annotation. So if I'm using a software to do annotations regarding to visual segmentations, so is it a good practice or it is a go for the clinical is good?
So I didn't understand your question. If you are using a software to do what?
Annotations, sir.
Yes.
Annotation for these images.
Right.
Is it a good practice or with the consultation of radiologist is good practice?
So again, so what do you mean? So you are using a software for
Image software I'm using, sir.
Image
J.
Okay.
Software I'm using for the annotation of the image.
Right.
So is it a good practice or not?
So it depends on what you are trying to annotate. So let's say that you are trying to annotate radiology images, so for your research purposes, and then you want to develop your AI models. I don't think there's a ImageJ. I mean, yes, ImageJ is good. It does provide you a lot of functionalities, but software like ITK Snap or 3D Slicer that you saw yesterday, those are the ones that provide you, let's say, more flexibility when it comes to collecting these annotations, saving them as multiple different levels, 2D, 3D, doing some analysis on that. Yeah, so that is what I would recommend. But a lot of times people have used ImageJ, but they are mostly for more, simpler images. Okay. Any other questions?
So sir, you told about the material transfer agreement,
Yes.
MTA.
Yes.
So sir, my question is when we are going for the hybrid solution, or when we are giving the cloud setting for the considering the factors and site of deployment you told. So sir, in that case also material transfer agreement will be a major concern, because first of all it is costly. The material transfer agreement, getting all those agreements, it is costly first of all, and also when we are deploying it into the cloud, it is also costly. So in that case, I think cloud settings should not be a better option.
So it again depends. So I see what you're trying to get at. So it all depends on what you need, what your enterprise can support, right? So if, let's say, your task is very compute heavy and you do not have those kinds of resources, or you cannot, you don't have the budget for those kinds of resources, then you would, resources as in the cloud, then you would probably buy something that's a little bit cheaper on-prem. But if you have those budgets and you don't want to, deal with the hassle of having local IT maintain these things, then I think a lot of places go for cloud deployment. Yes, the MTA, the material transfer agreement, or the DUAs, the nature of it will change, and I can't really talk much about that because it's more legal in nature. I'm sure, like in the MTAs, in the DUAs, you will have proper terms and conditions that tell how it should be used. So let's say that you are using something to transfer data. So I'm sure you've used Dropbox or Box, something like that. So there are HIPAA controlled storage devices, which means that these storage, I mean by storage devices, I mean these HIPAA controlled cloud storage that still let you upload clinical data. It's okay to have patient names. It's okay to have identifying information, but you cannot do that on Google Drive. Okay, so Google Drive, there might be, I'm not aware of it, there might be versions of Google Drive where you can do that, but typically people don't use Google Drive for uploading patient data. Okay, it's not HIPAA compliant, at least on our end. Okay, but yeah, you're right. The complexities of how these agreements are written and executed will be very different if you have on-prem versus on cloud.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. So dataset curation, image pre-processing, and annotation. We covered a little bit on that. So when you collect your dataset, you need to anticipate potential biases, and we covered how different kinds of demographics, different let's say different population settings can have slightly different image presentations, which means that when you collect the data, you need to have different as much heterogeneity as possible. And however, okay, so even though I say that we should do that, but a lot of times what happens is just because of the nature of the problem, it's not possible to get that kind of data, right? So let's say you're working in a lab, your PI tells you that okay, this is a problem that we have to solve. Here's the data, right? I mean, you need to get started somewhere. You need to start developing these systems, and then at some point when you let's say you are ready to start the translation process, that's when you start having these discussions regarding these different kinds of uh, uh, heterogeneity if your data set already does not have it. Also, when you look at clinical papers, I'm not talking about technical papers. So if you look at machine learning papers or vision-based papers, you won't really have this analysis on how this model performs on males versus females, or how this model performs on different let's say age groups, right? So less than 20 years, 20 to 40 years, 40 to 60 years. So this is probably not that important when it comes to technical papers or vision papers, machine learning papers. But when you look at a lot of the clinical papers, high impact clinical papers, most likely, or I think almost 100% of the time, you will see that the first table or the first figure that they will have in the paper will be about the data set distribution, will be about the demographics. What is the age distribution of the patient? What is the sex distribution of the patient? Does the patient have any kind of comorbidity? Right, and also other kinds of factors. If you have the race of the patient available, like you have to summarize the race of the patient. So the reason these publications, these clinical publications, want you to have this information is that when you train your model, or when someone reads your paper, they should know what kind of data set your model was trained on, right? So for those of you who have worked on medical imaging, do you consider this? Right. So when you write these papers, clinical papers, if you have to consider these data distribution aspects. Okay. So curate data set from multiple sites, like I said, to ensure robustness and generalizability of the model. And then we have to standardize the annotation, de-identification, and pre-processing. So standardize the annotation. What does that mean? So a lot of times what happens is you need annotations for training a segmentation model, and let's say your data set has 500 images, and these are 3D images. And getting 500 annotations from one person, from one expert, might be very expensive or might be very time consuming on the expert's part. So what happens is you divide the work, right? You have 3 different experts. You say, okay, take the first 20 images, or take the first 100 images, take the second 200 images, the next 200 images, and please annotate them for us. Now, if you do that, just think about it. That means that you are invariably infusing some sort of subjectivity there, right? Because clearly the first expert will be slightly different from the second. Doesn't matter how much you tell them that this is a protocol you have to follow. We are humans, so it's humans. Bless you. If it's human nature to err. So we will at some point see that there will be differences, despite the set protocols. There will be differences in the nature of the annotations that you get. So that's why we need to standardize annotations. And what does that mean? So yes, identify a protocol, tell your experts that this is a protocol that each of you has to follow, so that to the best extent possible, we make sure that they are sort of standardized. But after that, you need to have some sort of a more expert reader. Like if you have 3 experts, you need to have a super expert, and they need to quickly go through all the annotations and see if some major change is required. Then what you can say in your work, or ideally what you should do, is you can say that 3 experts were involved in the annotation process. The data was split equally between them, and the annotations were after that verified and corrected by a more senior expert. Right? So something like that, if that's possible. The other way that could be done is, and that this is usually done when you don't have a lot of data. So let's say that you have 200 samples, and you want to minimize variability. So what you can do is you can have the 200 samples annotated by both the experts. So if you have 2 experts, you have both the experts annotate the 200 samples. Then you do some analysis to figure out which of the samples there was a lot of disagreement on, right? Then you go back to the experts and say that, okay, these are the 10 samples where, you and you, like A expert A and expert B did not agree on. Could you please talk to each other and see what should be done? And this is mostly true. Segmentation, it's okay, because sometimes segmentations are off by a few pixels, which probably won't matter a lot. So I take that back. It will matter a lot depending on what the eventual use case is, right? But let's say that might not matter a lot. But if it is some sort of diagnosis, if the experts differ on diagnosis, then we have to ensure that the model is trained on the right diagnosis, right? So that's when you have to get the consensus of the experts. So that's why you'll see that when it comes to the dataset curation step, you'll see a lot of papers, they say that this decision, the ground truth was arrived at based on consensus between the experts. Okay. Any questions here? So all of these things are important. I know that when you get your data, you want to jump into training a model, but as you get deeper and deeper, as you get further in your research career, you will know that these are the things that are more important. And I mean, I can say that when I started as an enthusiastic student, I was like, okay, I want to train my first model. I want to train my model. I want to get papers done. I never stopped to, or I never paused to think about how these things can actually affect the downstream performance. But over the years, I've realized that the sooner you do this, the better it is. Okay. Cool. So if you do, you have any questions on the previous slide, by the way?
Sir, my question is about the pre-processing and stuff.
Yeah.
Actually, I have seen like more people, those who focus on like model development and training, and then they follow the other papers work very closely with the model development, like training and stuff and all. But they more often than not they try to ignore the pre-processing step, and then each paper follows a different pre-processing step. Like one way or other way, they'll just change, and they don't actually give the complete details of how they have pre-processed the data. And then like I'm not sure like how it affects the processing, but because for me like the pre-processing has affected like very much. So like what kind of suggestion do you give for the people who are involving this machine learning and deep learning? So what kind of step do we have to follow for the proper pre-processing and the, stuff and all before training?
Yeah. So the pre-processing obviously depends on your modality and your application. So for example, in digital pathology, you have pre-processing steps like color normalization. For radiology, if it's MRI images, you will have pre-processing steps like intensity standardization. A lot of times you have registration. So in brain MRI images, you have to register everything to like a common atlas before you do your downstream tasks. So these are all pre-processing steps. And you're right, a lot of papers don't give out these details, but you'll see that high impact publications will have these details. Doesn't matter if it's there in the main paper or in the supplementary. If they don't have these details, I'm sure it won't get accepted, right? So it's a very important point, and this is for all of you. When you write your papers, you have to provide your pre-processing details. Obviously, a lot of times your papers will say, okay, it's a 8-page limit, 6-page limit, you don't have enough space, but they will accept supplementaries. So you provide this detail in the supplementaries. But what I've observed is that especially a lot of these new machine learning papers, these foundational model papers, they don't have details regarding that, because their argument is that because it's a foundation model, the foundation model should see as much variability as possible, right? So according to them, these initial pre-processing doesn't really matter. And you can see why their argument might hold true, because in some sense, you would want your model to perform well on variety of data. But eventually, when you want to go towards model deployment, and let's say it's a niche case, you have to do this pre-processing. At least if you use the foundation models, you are not using the foundation models as is. You will do some fine tuning after that. You will just use the foundation model as a feature extractor, right? So, but I think we should be doing the pre-processing that we are doing for a real clinical model. Yes.
You told about like getting the consensus of both the experts. So sir, in day 2, you while like teaching us the radiomics analysis, you told that like if there are two like reader, like one is giving 42% and another giving maybe 50%, and we are like annotating it with the machine learning reads, and we are getting the, after doing the radiomic classifier, we are getting the like it is 92% or something, like it is giving the more eligible. So sir, my question is in which respect we go for the consensus of both, like both the reader or the pathologist, and in which aspect we go for the machine learning?
Okay, so good. Someone is actually following my lectures. What he's saying, there was a slide in my, I think in the very first day, where I said that radiologist 1 was I think 42% accurate. Radiologist 2 was 50%, yeah, 50% accurate, and then the machine was 75% accurate, right? So his question is, when do we go for a consensus? When do we go for the machine read, right? So these figures that we saw on day 1, this was for the in the inference stage, in the test stage. What I was talking about today is the training of the model. So to get ground truth of the model, what I was saying is we need to get some consensus, right? Because if radiologist 1 says that this case is cancer and radiologist 2 says that that case is benign, what label will you take for your model training, right? Like you don't know. So you have to talk to your radiologist, ask them to go for ask them to look at it, go for a consensus, and then see if they can arrive at either a cancer or a benign decision. Now there might be cases where they still cannot decide, right? But that usually will not happen, because eventually you will have some, like the patient would have been treated, right, based on whether they had cancer or did not have a cancer. And they will have, let's say, some pathology, biopsy or resection done for confirmation. So you will have that information. If you don't have that information, what a lot of models do is you can consider them as, let's say, independent samples to some extent, and you can ask the radiologist, how confident are you that this is cancer? You can ask the second radiologist, how confident are you that this is benign? So maybe you can take that confidence into account with the label, and there are methods to do that as well. Okay?
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay. I'll cover a little bit about how to get more labeled data. Obviously, it's not possible to get infinite labeled data. It's very expensive, like we saw. So obviously, one way is traditional supervision. You have your experts annotate as much data as possible. And the second is semi-supervised learning. So you use some structural assumption to automatically leverage unlabeled data. So for some data, for some of your data points, you have labeled data. For some of your data points, you do not have labeled data. So it's some sort of a semi-supervised learning, or if you have partially labeled data, that's semi-supervised learning. You can also have weak supervision. So a lot of applications, a lot of not clinical use cases, a lot of methods are developed with data that are with annotations that are weakly supervised. So by that, what I mean is, so let's say that you have an image, a brain tumor image, and you have a brain image, and you have a tumor somewhere here. So let's say that it's very difficult to get these segmentations from the experts. Or you have an X-ray scan. Let's say you have a lung X-ray, a chest X-ray scan. You have the COVID infiltrates or the pneumonia somewhere here. It's very difficult to ask the radiologist to go through the hundreds or thousands of X-rays that you have to annotate where the lesion is. So what you can ask them to do is, okay, let's not do an exact annotation of where the disease is. Can you just put an arrow that this is where the disease is? Just put an arrow, or just draw a line, right? Or just do something like a small squiggly sort of a sketch. Okay. So a lot of methods are developed with this sort of weak supervision. You don't have the exact annotation, but you can still use this weakly supervised annotations to train your models. Okay, and we have also done that. We published a paper in ICLR a few years ago that does this. And then transfer learning. So if you remember, I showed you the slide where we were using a pre-trained model to generate blood vessels. So that was a transfer learning setting where you use another model to train whatever segmentation task you want to do, and then you transfer the weights and you basically generate your segmentations on the new data set, and then you can use techniques like active learning or uncertainty analysis to identify only the areas, only the, let's say, the regions of interest that need to be corrected by the radiologist, by the pathologist, and only provide those limited regions to them, right? So there are these methods that you can use as well to get more labeled training data. Okay, so once you have your whole data set, you need to divide your data set into training, validation, and testing. So there are different ways you can do this, either a 70, 20, 10 rule, or it depends. So a lot of times your test set is completely independent. If it is completely independent, you can divide your training and validation into 70% and 30%. So it all depends on how much data you have. Okay, so in the training set, what you do is you teach the model patterns. You teach the model the patterns in the data, and the model learns the task. And in the validation, you tune the model. You identify the best parameters, and you choose what architecture is the best. So let's say that you have, with vision transformers, you can have different, let's say, variations of these transformers. So you can have small versions, you can have large versions, you can have huge versions. So depending on how deep the network is, so you can have different complexities of the architecture. You can try all of them out, but they have to be validated on the validation set. You have to decide the parameters and then just stop at the point where you think that this is the model that you want to use. So you have to lock your model down. Okay. You have to make sure that it doesn't overfit to the training sets. A lot of times when you train your models, and you can try this out, start with a simple deep learning model training. You have your training loss, you have your validation loss. At some point you'll see that as you keep training your model, the loss keeps getting lower and lower and lower and lower. But if you keep going and you basically have the model trained towards the very end and choose those parameters, then when you apply it on your test set, you'll see that your model does not do well because there's some sort of overfitting that is going on. So you have to make sure that you minimize overfitting as much as possible. By overfitting, what I mean is your model does well on the training set. You see that your training set accuracy will be 95%, 99%. As soon as you go to your validation set or your test set, you'll see that it's like 40, 50%, 70%, right? So which means that your model is overfitted to your training set. And then you have your test set. The test set evaluation is done only after the model is fully frozen. Yes, so if the model performs well on training, test, and validation, it is likely to generalize. If it performs well only on the training set and doesn't perform well on the test set, it could imply some overfitting. So the machine learning pipeline, to summarize, you have data ingestion. You split the data, like I said, into your train validation test set. Before that, you'll have to have the data preparation. You have model training. You decide your model, train your model, validate your model, evaluate it. After you have evaluated it, you test the model, and then you register and deploy the model. And obviously, there's a stage of monitoring and feedback. You have to get continuous feedback from the clinicians once the model has been deployed. And based on that, you can always refresh or retrain your model. Okay, so now what are the different modalities of data? So like we have seen over the past 2-3 days. So just summarizing that, you can have personal demographic data, you can have imaging data, pathology data, omics data, transcriptomics data like we saw yesterday, and also EHR and clinical data. So we haven't covered that. I'm sure many of you here are working on that. So when, let's say, patients are admitted to the clinic, you have their vitals that are measured, right? Their blood pressure or their heart rate and other kinds of vitals. When you take the blood work, you'll have many different parameters. So a lot of these data, or most of this data, is entered to the health records. So if available, you should take this data into account as well while training your model. So once you have integrated the data sets, so these are the different tasks, or the typical tasks. You can have many more tasks. segmentation of the detection, segmentation, classification of the disease, survival prediction. Sorry, there's a typo here. And then you can have longitudinal disease tracking as well. So by longitudinal disease tracking, what I mean is that, and we saw a few examples, how is the disease progressing? So is the patient getting better? Is the patient getting worse? Is the treatment working? Is the treatment not working? So these are typically the kinds of applications. And then orchestration. So this is important because after the model is run on the inference set or on the new data set, on the test set, how do you provide the results to the clinicians? Right? So we haven't discussed that in detail. I mean, yes, we discussed the interpretability aspect where we saw the gecko outputs, and I showed how it can be made more explainable. But clinicians, or let's say radiologists, pathologists, they are sort of they are individuals who like to see images. Like, so how do you present to them these results? So typically, when it comes to using these images, ingesting these images and pushing the outputs, so you have something called the PACS system, Picture Archiving and Communication System. Okay, so all the radiologist or the radiology systems, when the images are collected using these scanners, they are saved in the PACS system. The PACS system has the functionality to display the image and to annotate the image. So because this is something that the clinician sees, they don't have Slicer installed on their machine. They don't have ITK Snap, right? So these are all research software. They have more clinically focused software within the PACS system. Okay. Now the PACS system can have multiple components. So one of the components is the clinical PACS that they use to actually visualize the images. They can rotate, they can pan, zoom, crop, do multiple different things, annotate. But then there's a research PACS also, because as researchers we won't have access to the actual PACS system because that is what they use to make their decisions. The hospital will make sure that the research, the clinical PACS is available only to the clinicians who are involved in decision making. But we as researchers, we want to see if we can visualize some of these images, push our results. So what the IT system does is they create a research PACS. Now this research PACS is more important for us as model developers, because once we develop our model, and first of all we have to do some sort of validation, some sort of evaluation on the hospital data set, right? In order to do that, we want to test our model and push the results back to the doctor. Now we cannot push it back to the clinical PACS. That's not allowed. We push it back to the research PACS. Now they can log in to the research PACS and they can see how our model has performed. Okay, so research PACS is something that developers or researchers have access to. And a lot of times, because of telemedicine, the doctors might not be around at the desk. They still want to be able to make decisions. So you have phone apps where you can communicate or you can send these results to. They can look at it on the phone. And web link. By web link, what I mean is you provide them a link. When they click the link, it will take them to a sort of a PACS system, but that is hosted on the cloud. Right? So these are different ways in which clinicians can interact with the decisions that a model spits out. Okay. So coming back to multimodal AI again, you have radiology images where you have X-rays, MRIs, PET scan, and so on, pathology slides. You have different kinds of imaging reports, genomic data, and genomic data can include different kinds of mutations, MGMT, EGFR status, TERT mutation, and so on. And then clinical data, like I said, you can have different labs, vitals, demographics, and so on. So put together, we can develop these true multimodal predictors of disease diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment response assessment. So this was one of the first papers that came out when that dealt with classifying the ImageNet dataset with deep convolutional neural networks. And then this is the paper that sort of changed the paradigm, and nowadays it's mostly about transformers. And the underlying, let's say, theory or the concept there is attention. By attention, what I mean is how does one part of your data relate to another part of the data, right? So that's the attention mechanism. So yesterday we saw one of our applications where we used LSTM. So nowadays we don't really, it's long short-term memory networks. We don't use LSTM anymore. It's mostly about transformers. And this is one of the papers that changed it all, the vision transformer paper, which says that an image is worth 16 cross 16 words. Okay, so why is AI in medicine different? First, access to data is uneven globally, right? So the kind of access that, let's say, people in Europe will be very different from the kind of access that people in Asia will have. Even in Asia, the kind of access that researchers in China will be very different to the kind of access that researchers in India will have. So a lot of that is dictated by the demographics of the population, what is the nature of the disease. For example, when I was a PhD student, I was working with that radiation necrosis recurrent tumor project. Some of the head and neck cancer data that we got was from a hospital in China. And we could not get that kind of data from hospitals in US because people in the US did not have that kind of cancer, right? So it depends on where that kind of cancer is more prevalent, okay? Affordability limits deployment in low middle income countries. So there are a lot of grants that, at least that in the US, where we have these grants where we can develop techniques that can be deployed in low middle income countries. And equity across populations is not guaranteed. There can be differences in population, this heterogeneity that we spoke about, and interpretability is essential to clinical trust. So not just in pathology that we discussed yesterday, but also in radiology, if a model makes mistakes, we need to know why the model is making a mistake, right? We need to tell the clinician what sort of data the model was trained on. During the training stage, what sort of mistakes that the model actually made. So these kinds of interpretability techniques are essential to garner clinical trust so that models can be deployed in the clinic. Medical expertise is also geographically imbalanced. It's not just data availability. So for a fact that I know that the number of pathologists available per 100 or per 1,000 patients in India is very different from the number of pathologists available for the same number of people in the US. For that matter, radiologists or other kinds of clinicians as well. And a lot of places you have more specialized clinicians. You will have, let's say, cardiothoracic radiologists. You will have breast radiologists. You will have, other radiologists with more specialized expertise. And in other places, you will just have general radiologists, where the same radiologist will have to read everything, right? So there is obviously difference in medical expertise also. It's not just data availability. It's important, and this is where the foundation models come in. These foundation models are trained in high resource settings. I mean, you'll see that most of the foundation models that have come out are probably from industry, right? From the Googles, from the Metas, and so on. Very few foundation models come out from academia. The reason is that they have the money, they have the compute, right? So as academicians in academic institutes, we don't have, and it's very difficult to expect to have that kind of compute because of the money involved. That doesn't mean that we should stop doing research, right? Eventually, the people who developed these models in these companies came out of, there were people like you, right, who went from universities, who had more advanced degrees, PhD degrees. They went there and they trained these models. Sam Altman, he did not train models. The people who trained models were the ones who did the PhD and joined OpenAI, right? So, but having said that, high resource settings are mostly available in industry, so that's why you have these AI models, these foundation models coming out of there. But we have to ensure that the way we use these models, they have to be properly tuned to be applicable to settings that we have, in the local hospitals that you want to deploy your models. Deployment often occurs under distribution shift. So like I said, model trained on one distribution of data, when it encounters out of distribution data, it might not work. So there are techniques to account for this distribution shift that we should incorporate into our model making, into our model training. Data set issues, we touched on this. Sometimes key predictors might be missing and there can be poor quality data. We have to make sure that the data is properly quality checked and the poor quality data is either removed or somehow we modify that data to make it high quality. so this is very important. More data does not necessarily imply better data. So a lot of times you would think that, oh, I don't have enough data, that's why my model is not getting better. That's not the case. So yes, in an ideal world, if you get more and more data, your model training should get better and better. You should get better results. But usually, if you have, usually, that's not the case. Or other way around. That's usually the case, but sometimes you'll see that if you have a lot more data, that doesn't necessarily mean that your model is getting better. That's because you would expect that the reason why a model should get better with more data is if you're introducing more variability into your training. If you include more data, but the nature of the data or the kind of, let's say, information that is there in that data is still same as what was there in the previous data set, you are not introducing any variability into model training. So why will the model learn something else? Right? It will still learn what it has learned. It won't get marginally better. It might get a little better, but it won't get a lot better. AI cannot fix flawed data sets. So clinical data sets are small and heterogeneous, like we saw. Foundation models assume massive data availability, so that's why these models, are good, let's say, feature embedders. But this mismatch can lead to brittle systems, and that's why we have to do these fine-tuning, these active learning sort of applications or sort of settings. We have to deploy them in these settings so that they keep getting better. So coming back to our Gen AI, so why do we generate medical images? Because this can help us augment data sets. For example, with the missing modalities, missing protocols that we spoke about, you can have FLAIR T1 post contrast. You may not have a T2 sequence, and then you can use a diffusion model to generate a T2 sequence, and then you can also train generative AI models to predict response to treatment. So today, and this is work that that Monak has been doing over the last year or so, where you can take a pre-treatment image, you can develop a Gen AI model to predict how the post-treatment image will look like. It's not just predicting the response, but also predicting how the image will change, how the lesion will change. Okay, so you see how this is how the pre-treatment was, and you see after the post-treatment, this is how it look, and we predicted that, right? So these are other applications of Gen AI systems. Is there a question? No? Okay. So let's move on. So we can wrap this up in the next few minutes, and then we'll go to the QA session. So another application that we have been pursuing is using proper conditions to generate images. I mean, yes, you can ask your Gen AI model to take this image, take image A and generate image B, but we have seen that if we do that, a lot of times the image does not respect the geometry. It does not respect the topology of where the different constituents of the image are. Now, just to simplify that, the different parts of a brain. So, what are the different parts of a brain? Can you that are observed on images?
Cerebrum, medulla.
Okay, but what are the different tissue structures? So these are the different components, but what are the different tissue structures? Like white matter.
Gray matter.
Right. What else?
And
CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, right? And then if you have tumors, then you can have the different compartments of the tumors. So what we showed was that if you just take existing generative AI techniques and use those to generate images, these images do not respect the geometry, the morphology, the topology of the different compartments here, like gray matter, white matter, CSF. So what we then did was we extracted these. We used a segmentation technique, extracted the white matter, gray matter, the ventricles, and so on, and then we used that to condition the generative model to generate synthetic images. If we did that, the quality of the generation improved a lot. So this is work still under review, but this is something that should be done. It's not just blindly applying generative AI or training Gen AI techniques. So this is the same project where we used anatomy guidance, and then once we train a model, we can use it as a feature extractor for multiple different downstream tasks. Okay. So something else, so yeah, foundation models, like I said, they're trained on imaging data, language data, other health data, and they can help us with all these different capabilities. So we just saw a few examples, but it can help in enhanced communication, better report generation. It can obviously help us advance diagnostic support, streamline workflows, and more importantly, discover population level insights. So you might be interested in not just what's happening to a given patient, you want to understand what's happening at a population level. So because foundation models have been trained on so much data set, they have a better capability of helping us understand what's happening at a population level. So this is again recent work that we have done in our lab. So we have seen that when we applied existing foundation models on different data sets, and this is in neuroradiology, we found that these models don't really do well. One of the problems that we observed was indeed the distribution shift. Like they don't take into account the distribution shift. So what Moinak did was he incorporated this distributionally robust loss function that helped us encounter this distributional shift between the different data sets. So maybe we can pass the mic to Moinak and he can quickly explain what this DRO loss is.
So, am I audible?
Yeah.
So, when you train a deep learning model, what happens is it tries to overfit. Yesterday we saw the example, right? The adenocarcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma. So, the number of patients in squamous cell carcinoma was much larger than adenocarcinoma, and the model kind of fitted there. So, when we train a foundation model, we take the data set from all the available institutions that we have. So let's say institution A has, let's say, like a large number of patients, and all the other institutions have smaller cohort size.
Just walk over here so that the mic can focus, the camera can focus.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so yeah, I was saying like the model might learn the data only from the institution which has the largest number of patients. But like it's bad that we are ignoring the other institutions or the other patients. So what to do? So that is where I designed this distributionally robust optimization loss. The distributionally robust optimization loss. So what it does is very simple. So we have different distributions like institution A, institution B, institution C. You can consider them as different statistical distributions. And rather than training the loss, which is minimizing the loss function on all the cohorts combined, you just wait more on, or you just ask the model to learn more on the cohorts which have lesser patients, and like kind of, a bit weighted less on the patients which have larger patients. So in turn, what happens is you give equal weightage to all the different distributions, all the different patients. And so that is one thing, like focusing on different institutions, but there can be another angle to it. So for example, maybe most of the patients, like for brain tumors, like let's say most of the patients might have primary brain tumors, which is glioblastoma or gliomas. And there can be very limited set of patients who have metastasis or who have meningioma. And now you train a foundation model without the group DRO loss, the model will always predict it, whatever the prediction it will make, will overfit on gliomas. And it will perform very poorly on meningioma. So again, the group DRO loss kind of distributes this training, and then your model is kind of performing robustly on different types of tumors across different cohorts.
Okay, so yeah, so we can send you the link to the paper. You can always read up on how we implemented this. So what did we do after that? So we wanted to use this foundation model that we trained and to do prediction, to perform prediction on the different kinds of molecular markers. So we had the list of molecular markers that you see here, the ATRX, P53, TERT mutation, P10 mutation. So all of these kinds are markers are very important for eventual treatment of the brain tumor patients. So we use this foundational model to predict the different markers that were present. And these are some of our results. So for the most part, we saw that, so these were some of the existing methods, DINO, BYOL. When we included the DRO loss, the distributionally robust loss, our performance actually increased. So what this shows is that we can account for this distribution shift in the training itself. So if we do that, our model keeps getting better and better. Yes?
Sir, you told about the quality of the data.
Yeah.
So while we are applying the DRO loss, So maybe we are getting 150 samples of glioma and 50 samples of meningioma, what sir told. So let the data of the like glioma cells, while it is 50 only, but the data quality is much more better than those 150 cells of meningioma. So in that case, how DRO loss is going to like affect?
So here, so what we did here was assuming that once we did the pre-processing, the data quality wasn't an issue. So we had similar data quality because we performed pre-processing, we registered it to an atlas and did the skull stripping and whatever pre-processing in the same way for all the patients. So this DRO loss is specifically to take into account the, this class imbalance, right? So you have fewer number of, let's say, samples for one data set, more number of samples for another data set. How do we provide different weights to what we are learning from the lower represented class versus the higher represented class? So that's all that DRO loss does. It does nothing to improve the quality of the image. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So next, even though foundation models are great, these task-specific AI models aren't really going away. So if you have a specific task, a very niche task, by all means, if you have a simple enough method, an elegant method that you can train to solve that task, go for it. Just because you have foundation models doesn't mean you should use foundation models. Okay? But having said that, if you think that foundation models are giving you good representations, you can go ahead, fine-tune these foundation models for your task as well. So key point, these general models, these foundation models have broad capability because you can fine-tune them with on your data set that have fewer labels and they can be scaled across modalities. Task-specific models have high precision for well-defined problems, but they do not really translate well if you take another data. So let's say that you have trained a model on Apollo Hospital here, and if you're happy with the model and if you have the same kind of, let's say, patient distribution or data set distribution coming in, by all means, you can work with that model. But it's almost impractical to expect that the model that you have trained on this data set will work on some other data set, right? So if that's the case, you are better off using a foundation model or let's say retraining, fine-tuning your data. So the future of radiology AI or pathology AI is not either or, it's hybrid, and at times it's workflow independent. So there's this new concept that has been catching everyone's attention. It's called digital twin. So by digital twin, what we mean is, so you have the patients, so we create a digital version of the patient, a digital twin of the patient. So what that means is, when you have a patient, you can give for a particular condition, you can give them a drug, you can give them some treatment, and the treatment works in a certain way. Now ideally what we would want to get to, like for personalized treatment, for precision medicine, is we want to be able to know what if you give treatment A, what will happen to the patient. If you give treatment B, what will happen to the patient. If you give a combination of A and B, what will happen, right? So there can be many different permutations and combinations. And it's difficult to actually have enough patients with all these different kinds of settings to train a model. So which means if we can train a digital version, like if we can train a twin of the patient, then we can turn certain knobs, and the doctor can then say, okay, if you give treatment X plus treatment Y, then this is how the patient will respond. If you give just treatment X, this is how the patient will respond. So we should give a combination of treatments, right? So that's the idea behind digital twins. So however, to train good digital twins, to train high fidelity digital twins, we need to have multimodal data, because usually for the most part treatment decisions are based on multimodal data. They don't just look at the images and say if the patient will respond or not, right? So now if the patient has a certain disease and if the patient is really old, for example, then the doctors will know if the patient can tolerate that treatment or not, right? Sometimes you'll see, and I'm sure you would know of cases where because the patient is old, the doctors say, okay, let's not treat that patient because they cannot really tolerate this patient. We just manage them in a way that can make their life better, that can prolong survival. As opposed to if there's a younger patient who we know could possibly tolerate that treatment better, then they would give that treatment to them, right? So this is not just looking at the patient's image and giving a treatment. consider all these other factors, you consider comorbidities. For example, let's say, and this is something that happened to a relative of mine, they had diabetes, right? And because of diabetes, they had to wait to actually treat them in a certain way, right? They have to give them some medicines so that, that's under control before treating them, right? So, and sometimes patients are on blood thinners, right? If they are on blood thinners, a lot of times while doing surgery, something wrong might happen. So you have to take them off those drugs and then give the treatment to them. So inherently, treatment is multimodal. And what digital twin can do is it can help us simulate that multimodal scenario. Okay, so what we have done is, in the context of brain cancer, we want to predict if there's response or non-response and how the patient will respond. And what we are doing is we are collecting different kinds of data, such as, I'll show you what we have done here. We have, in the context of brain tumors, you can have surgery, you can have radiation therapy, you can have chemotherapy. And also, it's not just that. For the training data set, we have the days to treatment. After surgery, how many days elapsed before the first treatment was given. After that, how many days to the second treatment. So you have this time information as well. It's not just the image information. So you can take all of this and you can develop your partial differential equation and combine them with deep learning models to predict how the tumor size will increase or decrease due to different treatments. So that's what we did here. And we found that, I won't really go into details of this. You can always look that up in the paper that's currently on archive. So we saw that here we wanted to predict how the treatment will affect the disease, and DSC stands for dissimilarity coefficient. We see for the different methods, for UNET, for Cornwell STM, for a neural OD method and ours, how the predicted size change was different. So that's what we saw in this particular project. So this is still very new. We are still working on this. There are multiple groups that are doing this, but eventually we would want to get to a point where we can use the different kinds of treatment options that are there, different kinds of, let's say, modalities of data that are available, and train a digital twin that can help the doctor, provide some information as to what if scenarios, right? So that's what we want to tell them. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, so let's stop here. And yeah, so by the way, if there are any questions, we can take questions. Sorry.
For digital twin, what kind of data we would need? Because what it seems that if we want to maybe create digital twin, the property of all the data, that basically the features that we collected, that should also evolve as the patient would evolve.
What does that mean? So evolve as the patient would evolve?
Like, imagine, let's say, for a 10-year-old patient, we collected some attributes or some features.
Okay.
And if we are talking about the digital twin, maybe 5 years down the line, the properties might change.
What properties?
Like in terms of the shape and all, right? So, for example,
yes. Yeah. So you're saying that, okay, so you're saying that the way the image looks now will be different from the way the image looks 5 years down the line?
Yes.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, in order to create such models,
you will need sequential data.
Yes.
Yes. So you will need, so digital twin is inherently temporal, right? So you have imaging data not just from today, but ideally you would want imaging data from today, from the first treatment, second treatment, 1 year down the line, 2 years down the line. And it's not just imaging data. You should have the corresponding clinical data or EHR data, reports data also on the multiple time points, because you're right, because of how the human body ages, right? So obviously the image will also change. Because of treatment, the image will change further. The kinds of other data that we obtain will change. So yes, unless you have this temporal data, you cannot really train a digital twin. Yeah. It's not just getting a data today and predicting what will happen tomorrow. That's not something clinicians will believe in.
And then at least the settings like India, here what happens, a patient gets treated at different hospitals, and the drugs that they get introduced to, that may have different effects. Yes. So my digital twin might get outdated than what we could have earlier.
So you are right. Different patients can get treated at different places. Sometimes the data may not be available, and obviously because of these different variations, it's difficult to control how these models can be trained. But having said that, if there is enough data with these variability, if there's enough data with patients treated at different hospitals, it's the same concept as a foundation model. Eventually, if your model sees enough variability, you would expect that it has learned something, right? And yes, you have different kinds of chemo treatment. You have different radiation treatment. It's not different kinds. There are a few kinds, but let's say newer and newer drugs are coming out, right? So that's why you're saying that digital twins can get outdated, right? But what we can do is we can always retrain these models with the newer data and still keep what was happening with the old data, because the older version of the digital twin has still seen some biology, right? So fundamentally, there is something that would still be common between what happened to X group of patients 5 years ago and what will happen to the new group of patients with new kinds of treatment, right? We don't want to lose that information. We can always fine tune our model with newer information, but hopefully with the models we are training, we can retain some of the old information, so that that can help in understanding response to tumors, right? Response to treatments.
I get it. I mean, on the other angle, if we see this digital twin, the data itself is very, very critical,
Yes.
right? I mean, so there has to be maybe a common governance around this.
Yes.
that will kind of secure or maybe mask such data, so that I mean our PII is still there. Basically, the PHI is still denonymized, I would say.
Yes. So yeah, obviously, you have to do all these things. There'll be PHI information, so you have to anonymize all of this. But you're correct that these data sets. So again, digital twins, it's still very early days. There are not enough data sets that we have to train digital twins. In fact, one of our efforts in our lab is to create this synthetic data to train digital twins. But eventually there has to be some governance, not just from the privacy preserving perspective, but also creating these benchmarks, where we start to create these data sets that people can train their digital twins on. Nothing like this exists currently.
Okay. And sir, also I have question around a lot of the papers that we have gone through since last 4 days. It looks like more of a small task that will get done out of these. Do we have set of kind of agentic like framework where we'll have sequential, right, combine these tasks in a pipeline, and that will help the clinicians or
Right.
radiologists?
Yeah, very good point. So what you're trying to say is that the works that we have reviewed so far, they are for very specific tasks. So what if you had your data set and you had a model, an AI agent that could take that model and automatically decide what sorts of, let's say, pipelines could be applied, pre-processing, AI models, what sort of parameters, and then decide what could be done to, and what are the different tasks that could be done, right? So it's almost like an automatic, let's say, scientist or something, right? Yeah, so nowadays there's a lot of work that's being focused on this part. So in pathology, I know there are a few groups in Europe that are starting to develop these agentic AI systems, but still very early days. I think this digital twin can clearly fall under the umbrella of agentic AI, right? Because you have your data and then you basically try to train an AI agent to come up with different possibilities, right? So that's what you're trying to ask here, right?
Yeah, because agentic AI in the normal basically image processing has gone way beyond.
Yeah.
Right now, so it's like a normal. We give the normal prompt and we get a lot of things done, right, in image or video form. But what I felt, I'm not sure. Maybe you would be the right person to answer. Like how far we have gone in terms of.
Not far at all. Not far at all. I mean, I think it's still very early days.
And how many of the whatever we talked about, how many of these are already live in hospitals?
So that's the thing, right? So what is live in hospitals is actually the small tasks like detection, segmentation. Even report generation is not there in the hospital. They're still beginning to do that now. So digital twins applying, like actually translating to these hospitals, we are probably 10, 15 years away. Okay, so that's what I was trying to say. So when you look at the kind of the stage where we are with machine learning research, with CV research, computer vision research, we are at a very advanced stage. But when you look at what is there in the clinic, it's still at the very grassroots, right? Even the most fundamental problems are still unsolved. So yeah, I think we are ways off from actually seeing an agentic AI live in action in the clinic.
So I mean, as an expert, what's your
what needs to be done?
Yeah.
So what needs to be done is, like I said, you have to have enough systems. So if just from the point of digital twins, we have to have enough systems that are actually trained, that have been trained to build trust, and then also, like you said, with a lot of these new treatments coming up, we have to see how digital twins can be adapted to these new treatments. So these things need to be done before we can even see any of these digital twins in action.
Okay, I mean, I'm not asking about the digital twin. More
so just agentic AI systems, right? Yeah, so it doesn't have to be digital twins, even agentic AI systems. So we need to know what the eventual applications are. So here's the thing, and we'll see some of that in the next few slides in the second half of the lecture. It's not just about predicting or predicting a disease or detecting a disease. Eventually, we would want to know, or if a model has to be used in the clinic, there has to be certain value that the clinic will get out of it, right? It has to get some cost savings, first of all, because all hospitals are eventually, what they will care about is the revenue, correct? Yes, you can deploy AI systems, you can deploy agentic AI systems, but does it improve the clinical output? Does it improve the revenue, right? What is the return on investment? So these are actually the more important things that will dictate whether or when and whether these systems will actually make their way into the clinic.
I think what I feel from the medical side is like there are two bodies, one who is developing these systems and another is the hospitals themselves.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not sure how far they are able to kind of overlap each other to kind of bring in these systems.
Yeah, I mean slowly we are getting there. Slowly we are getting there. It's not a change that will happen overnight, and that's why we are writing these papers. That's why we are continuing to do the research that we are doing. So eventually, we are getting to the stage where we are sort of collaborating, and things are slowly making their way into the clinic. But like I said, very early days. Hopefully, eventually, it will happen sometime soon.
Sir, your insights on clinical considerations for AI deployment was very helpful. So I have questions on bias.
Bias, okay.
Yeah. If AI models are being trained on data sets from specific population, how do we prevent the predictions where the populations is from diverse groups?
So same concept applies. Either you start training population-specific models, like you have different models for different populations, so you can do that, or you start to fine-tune your models. You train it on one population and take limited examples from the second population, and you start to fine-tune those models. That's how you can do it.